Thank you very much. On behalf of the Association of the Families of Flight PS752 Victims, I want to thank the Madam Commissioner and her team for their efforts in this all-important endeavor and giving me the opportunity to offer my testimony. Like many in the Chinese and Russian and Indian communities, several 100,000 Iranians have made Canada our home. We are deeply concerned by the increasing threat posed to Canadian democracy, our civil society, and the communities who strive to participate in the cultural mosaic that makes this country so special. I would like to first start by emphasizing to this Commission the urgent importance to officially include the Islamic Republic of Iran in the terms of reference in the mandate of this Commission. By this inclusion, this Commission will be able to garner the cooperation and input of other security, diplomatic, and intelligence organizations in order to reach a more accurate and comprehensive view of the extent of the threat that the Islamic regime poses to Canadian society and the Iranian-Canadian community. As we all know, Iran is fundamentally a diverse, multi-ethnic society with people of different faiths and ethnicities making up the rich cultural tapestry of Iran's national identity. The first immigrants from Iran are reported to have arrived in Canada in 1901. By 1979, the Iranian community in Canada was no more than a few thousand, scattered around the country. In the aftermath of the revolution and the Islamic takeover of the government, the Iranian community in Canada has grown exponentially. Current estimates indicate that there are over 400,000 Iranians residing in Canada with a high concentration of Iranian Canadians in Ontario. While initially most Iranians were refugees who have fled the brutal repression and persecution of the Islamic Republic regime over the past 4 decades, Iranian residents of Canada include students, academics, entrepreneurs, and skilled workers from all walks of life. The Islamic regime has not been oblivious to these facts, and since the 1980s, the Islamic regime has focused on Canada for various reasons, including, among others, Canada's vicinity to the United States and the opportunities they may seek in their political and clandestine agenda. In the aftermath of what became known as the Woman Life Freedom Uprising in September 2022 that was sparked by the brutal murder of Mahsa Jina Amini, Iranian Canadians made history by coming together in the largest gathering in the political rally organized by my association and other activists in Toronto. On October 1st, 2022, over 50,000 people came together in Richmond Hill to express their solidarity with the brave young men and women in Iran and their opposition to the brutal Islamic regime in Iran. While the majority of Iranians who have immigrated to Canada are secular, they have not demonstrated a clear tendency to organize around ideological or partisan institutions. Despite the growing number of immigrants from Iran, engagement in the Canadian democratic institutions has been sporadic at best, with only a handful of Iranians finding their way into provincial or federal political positions. Ontario has had a few MPPs and provincial ministers from among Iranian Canadians, and so far only 2 MPs have reached the federal parliament. We are yet to have any ministers in the federal government from members of our community. Behind the political arena, Iranians have made remarkable progress in academia, business, arts and culture, medicine, and many other fields in Canada. This unfortunately has brought Canada and the Iranian community in this country squarely in the crosshairs of the Islamic regime and its nefarious plans to not only cause division and mayhem in the Iranian-Canadian community, but to also disrupt the Canadian political system in an effort to peddle influence in favor of its policies. I will talk about these in my next comments.
Would you please describe the forms of foreign interference that your community experiences?
To pick up where I left off in this first part of my comments, I would like to bring into focus how the Islamic regime in Iran seeks to interfere in the political system of democratic countries along its activities to disrupt and divide the Iranian communities around the world. As I noted earlier, the Islamic regime has demonstrated to have a special interest in Canada, and as such, it has made efforts on many levels, to further its agenda using the leverage it can muster through the Iranian community in this country. We can consider this effort in two main categories. First, to interfere in Canadian political affairs in service of the regime's interests, and second, to monitor and survey the Iranian community in Canada and identify political and civil rights activists who seek to promote democracy in their home country, but also to use its operatives to intimidate, harass, sometimes even threaten community members with the intent of blocking any dissent or organized efforts to expose the corruption of the regime on the international arena. Furthermore, there are several reports that have become public exposing terrorist conspiracies through Canada aimed at the United States that have been planned, funded, and directed by the Islamic regime in Iran. As an example, 2 years ago, there was reports about the assassination or kidnapping plot of a well-known reporter in the United States, and there were reports that there were 3 Canadians on the list of the kidnappers, but we never heard any report from our government or any report from intelligence services that who those people were and what was the plan. There is an existing indictment about that in the United States. Let me give you other examples for each of these main categories that merely represent the tip of a much larger and nefarious iceberg of interference by the Islamic regime in Canada. If I go to my personal experiences, I've been targeted for on social media. I've been targeted in Canada. If I go to some experiences, verbal attacks, physical attacks, like 20th of May last year was one of the examples. I'm sure police has a report of that when we had a gathering in Toronto. When I was in Toronto on last October in downtown Toronto, there was a person approached me. He was on a motorcycle, and then he stopped and he was searching his pockets for something, and then I had to leave the area, go back to the hotel, report to the police. And RCMP and police, I'm sure they have the reports. There were only a few examples. When I go to some names of the former officials of the Islamic Republic, I can say that a former minister of the Islamic Republic, when he was here, he threatened me too. So I would get to that. But once when I went to a grocery store on the spring of 2 years ago, when I went back, I had 2 flat tires on one side. I reported that to the police, and still I don't know what RCMP did or what the York police did, and I didn't get any report back. So about what they do in Iran, my parents, they are banned to leave the country. My mother is 73-year-old, my father is 74, and they plan to travel to Canada in November to participate in the 4th anniversary of the downing of Flight PS752. Their passport was confiscated, and now they know that they can't leave the country at least for 6 months. We don't know what happens after 6 months. And I can say about other family members of the victims in Iran, also they have been tortured, they have been imprisoned, and we have several reports supporting that fact. A very small minority of Iranians in Canada are engaged directly or indirectly as either sympathizers or sometimes even overt operatives of the Islamic regime. This small minority has, however, leveraged its financial advantages that mostly originate from inside Iran and political backing advantages that political backing from the Islamic regime to create institutions disguised as community advocacy groups, media, social media, or even research institutes that effectively seek to undermine the majority of the community that oppose the regime, as well as to meddle with the influence Canadian government and non-government institutions in favor of the regime's agenda. The level of sophistication of these plans is highly disconcerting to our community, and many of us are making our best efforts to identify and expose these covert and overt activities that we find highly dangerous and disruptive. Hence the importance of including the Islamic regime in the terms of reference of this commission. This small minority has demonstrated the intent and capacity to cause division in the Iranian-Canadian community while creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation here in this country. Many Iranians who participate in public events, such as the massive October 1st rally, wore masks to avoid being identified by the regime operatives. The documentary that was made about Flight PS752 had to anonymize many crew members in the final credits of the film because they were in fear of persecution and threats by regime operatives. Another highly concerning example is a multitude of revelations of the increasing number of Islamic regime officials who have sought and been granted permanent residency in Canada or got visa to come to Canada. When I go to examples, we have a person, Mahmoud Reza Khavari. He's a former banker, and he was the head of National Bank. He immigrated to Canada in 2011, and he was involved in corruption. And I'm sure the Canadian government and the intelligence services, they have reports about him. We have Morteza Talai. He was the former chief of police of Tehran. He was seen in Richmond Hill 2 years ago. We have Sayyid Hassan Ghazizadeh Hashemi, the former minister of the Islamic regime, that was seen vacationing in Montreal, Canada last August. I go to that thread right now. When I raised the issue on Twitter and I wrote to our government, this man had an interview with some media outlets inside Iran, and he said, when I come back to Iran, the actions of Hamid Ismailion and the foreign media will be retaliated. But he was free to walk in Montreal, go visit Casa Loma in Toronto a day after, and finally he went back without any consequences. Now I know that he can come back to Canada, but we have concerns that how the former minister of Islamic regime can come to this country, threat the activists here, and just freely go back. I go to another name, son of the current speaker of the Islamic Parliament in Iran, Ishaq Ghalibaf. He even initiated a lawsuit against Canadian government to obtain visa to come to this country. Hopefully, I'm happy that we heard his visa finally got rejected after the outcry of the community. Another person is Iran's representative in ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. He lives in Montreal, Farhad Parvarish. Not only because of denial and his role after the downing of Flight PS752 in misinformation campaigns, but this person had connections with Quds Force. He's the person who was the head of Iran Air for years for smuggling weapons to Syria with commercial airplanes. But this person is in Montreal and he's representing the Islamic regime. These are merely the high-profile names that have been exposed and unfortunately indicate the severity and the scale of this highly dangerous problem for Canada and the Iranian-Canadian community. I would like to emphasize that these are not benign attempts by regime officials who seek a better life in Canada, but serious indicators of money laundering at best, but also efforts to increase the presence and influence of regime operatives in Canada. I share our community's concerns that there may be thousands of other lesser-known regime of affiliates, officials and operatives who have found their way to Canada and the threat their presence poses to our society and communities. Last but not least, an example of how regime operatives have breached the very depths of our democratic institutions in order to interfere and peddle influence. Just recently, a member of the Iranian community in Canada sought to run as a member of the federal parliament. The intensity of the smear campaign against him went far beyond the normal fervor of political competition in Canada. We believe that this is indicative of a much more sophisticated and multi-layered attempt by the regime and its operatives to hinder the participation of Iranians opposed to the regime in the Canadian democratic institutions. On the other hand, There are examples of organized support for those who are known to be aligned with the Islamic regime in Iran. There are many alarming reports of a certain member of the federal parliament to be supporting regime sympathizers and even meeting with regime officials and parliamentarians in Canada. Again, these are just the tip of the iceberg that is visible to us, and we fear that these examples are indicators of a much more serious and dangerous problem that must be investigated and dealt with. Let me end with another example. The Islamic regime has a stranglehold on every aspect of social, political, economic, cultural, and civil life in Iran. Sports is, of course, no exception. Every sport category is closely monitored and influenced by various security, intelligence, political, and even military arms of the regime. All international sporting events are carefully orchestrated by the intelligence, propaganda, and military establishment of the Islamic regime. Every sport team, most especially soccer teams, are accompanied by a multitude of those operatives who not only seek to direct and monitor the athletes, but also disguise their covert operations under the guise of sporting events. For example, the entourage of a given soccer team usually reaches over 50 individuals in number, with nearly one-third of those individuals having no connections with the given sporting events. Shortly after the downing of Flight PS752 by the IRGC, where 177 innocent civilian lives, including that of my wife and 9-year-old daughter, was taken, we heard rumors of a so-called friendly soccer match that was planned to take place between the Canadian and the Islamic Republic national soccer teams. It was planned to be held in BC place in Vancouver. Against the backdrop of the tragic murder of so many Iranian Canadians, this was outrageous to us as families of the victims, but also to the community as a whole. Given the lack of diplomatic relations between Canada and the Islamic Republic regime, one wonders who was behind the planning and execution of such an event. Who were the liaisons on behalf of the Islamic regime here in Canada? Who supported or sponsored the event and why? We were asking how were the visas for the entourage being processed. Ultimately, we believe that this was an attempt to sports wash the criminality of the Islamic regime and to bury the story of Flight PS752. Fortunately, the community came together and posed not only serious questions surrounding this nefarious plan, but also helped to put an end and cancel the event. Again, this example demonstrates the level of sophistication and nefariousness of the Islamic regime's scheme to influence and meddle with community and political discourse in Canada. Thank you.
The last question for now is, would you please describe the impact that foreign interference has had on your community?
Yeah, as I explained before, I notice every time we go to rallies, several members of the community, they wear masks, sunglasses, hats to not be identified. There are reports that when they travel to Iran, their cell phones get confiscated, they get persecuted, interrogated. Their family members in Iran are under pressure. Even we have had members who met Canadian Parliament members here, and their family members in Iran have been pressured or have been interrogated. So this is the least that I can say. But as I said before, this doesn't let the members of the community to get engaged in especially in political levels. We have organizations here that they don't have any relations with the civic organizations in the community, with the cultural organizations in the community like Tiragan, Civic Association, civic organization like us, or even political members of the community like our parliament member, Mr. Ali Esasi, but they are everywhere. And they get funded by unfortunately, by our government. We have reports of some organizations that have been funded by the Department of National Defense or Canadian Armed Forces. And these are the questions on the table, that who are these people? and what our intelligence services organization, they know about them, because the community is fearful to ask and to act, because we know that they have endless financial resources and they can initiate lawsuits against everyone. Even now, when I'm testifying right now, I have to be very careful, because we are ordinary people, and it's not easy to fight with some organizations that they have financial resources and they know people, and they get the best support, not only from Iran, from other countries like Russia, China, the government of Russia, government of China. And I hope that this commission will start to add Iran to the terms of references. One of the other things that I have to say, when we go to Department of Justice in the United States, you go to the website, there are several people that you see that have been charged with foreign interference, but we don't see any Iranian name in Canada that have been pursued by Department of Justice. Recently, there was a person, Salman Samani. He was the Deputy Minister of Interior Affairs in Iran. At the time of blood in November in 2019, 1,500 people got massacred in the streets of Iran. And this person came to Canada and obtained a visa, and he was here. Fortunately, the Canadian government, they found him, but now they're deporting him instead of putting him on a trial for crimes against humanity. This is what the families of the victims have asked for several months, and our association is supporting too. When they see there's no consequences, I mean, the community doesn't feel safe, and they're worried. And when these names that I mentioned, when these terrible people are here in this country, and when they see that some organizations are very active, that's why the community doesn't feel safe to participate in lots of activities.
Thank you very much.